welcome to PsychSessions, conversations about teaching and stuff. I'm Eric Landrum, along with Garth Neufeld, your podcast hosts. As the name implies, we center on conversations about teaching, but we often veer into other interesting topics, which is the end stuff part of the title. This is episode number 5, where Garth had the opportunity to interview Dave Myers from Hope College in Michigan. Before you hear the interview, please allow me to share a couple of my own listening tips and some of my favorite moments. One of the neat things that's developing as we do podcasts together is that we get to meet people and go a little bit deeper into getting to know them. And I really appreciated that in the interview that Garth conducted with Dave Myers. You know, one of the things that we forget about sometimes, Dave told this story about it was never an issue in his family if he was going to college. It was what college he was going to select. I think sometimes as educators, we might forget about in those first-generation students, the where may not be as important as the if. And so to getting them to college is the big hurdle. And maybe in future generations, it's an automatic. And so I really enjoyed how Dave's comments made me think about that. Dave started as a pre-med major, and so we're seeing a continuing theme here of psychology faculty members who did not start out as psychology majors as an undergraduate. I think one of the best quotes that I like from Dave's interview from the podcast is that the best education is an education for an unpredictable future. And I can't disagree with that. And I think that's a sentiment we should all keep in mind as we're improving our teaching and learning in psychology. Hey, I was thrilled in this podcast that Garth mentioned skills. Skills are a big part of my mantra and things that I'm trying to promote in my career. And so I was thrilled to hear that. I love the story that Dave told about how he was seated at an international conference. He kind of went at the last minute. And then from that came a textbook authoring opportunity. And the rest, as we say, is history. And so, I don't know, there's something there for me about showing up and fully participating and being in the moment where opportunities presented themselves just because you happen to be at the right place at the right time. Sometimes good things happen just by showing up, I suppose. A couple other things to mention before I let you listen to the podcast interview. I'd like to, Dave has this interesting juxtaposition because at one point he talks about he's just a little guy at a small college, which is very humble, a lot of humility. But I loved it when he talked about, and it had the tone in his voice, nobody was going to outwork me. And so I don't know if that's a David and Goliath kind of thing, but this notion that, hey, I'm just a little guy at a small college. It's easy to go unnoticed. But no matter what, nobody's going to outwork me. And I love that work ethic. And look what he's been able to accomplish with that. And I think there's a lesson there that we can all take away from that. So please enjoy the podcast.
All right. Welcome to another podcast. I'm here with Dave Myers at his home on Bainbridge Island in Washington State. And I was going to say the title of the podcast, but I didn't even tell you what the title is. It's called PsychSessions. It's conversations about teaching and stuff.
Great.
So,
I look forward to it.
Yeah. So I'm so excited to be here with you today. And we were just catching up a little bit. You were showing me your new house, which we are sitting in. You've lived here for 10 days, it sounds like.
Correct.
And how long had you been working on this house for prior to this?
Oh, it's mainly my wife's project, but it's been a year and a half in the dreaming and making, I would say.
Okay.
On a property that's virtually adjacent to where I spent much of my growing up life here on Bainbridge Island, Washington, where my mother grew up and my father and mother lived when they were first married, and we had family property, and there's, as I showed you, right next door, another family property. And now I have 2 of my 3 children are in the area, and though we're still based in Michigan, when this property became available, it seemed like it was maybe a good idea to seize it.
Yeah. How long are you going to be based in Michigan for, you think?
Maybe approximately the rest of my life.
Okay. But we'll be seeing you on this side of the country.
More often, probably.
Okay, good. Well, hey, a lot of what we've been doing with this podcast is really just getting back into your story, or whoever's being interviewed, their story, and you have an important story to the teaching of psychology in the United States and worldwide, and so we probably want to get into some of that. But first, I want to ask you a question and see if you remember it. I was just interviewing Sue Franz, and she had told me about this story, and it has to do with a picture of you eating ice cream in an ice cream shop.
Right.
Is there anything to do? Do you remember this?
Yes. I don't remember the picture being taken, but when I was 3 years old, I was photographed for a wire service story that went around the United States having an ice cream soda. And why was that? It was the celebration of the 73rd anniversary of the invention of the ice cream soda by my great-grandfather, who accidentally and absent-mindedly mixed soda water and ice cream, and it turned out to be a great hit. And he went on to, in years after that, to own a chain of drugstores in Seattle. His name was G.O. Guy, and my name is David Guy Myers, so I bear that name in my middle name. And you can buy this photograph in the Bettman archives online, I discovered, for like $800 or something like that.
And you didn't buy it.
But this ice cream shop, this vintage ice cream shop in Seattle, one of my kids stumbled in there, some family members stumbled in there, and there's my picture on the wall. And you're asking me about that reminds me, I must go there someday and see that picture.
Do you know where it is? Do you know?
Yes. It's in the Fremont area, I think, on the north side of Seattle. So I know exactly where it is. I just have to get there someday and tell the owner, that's me.
Oh, that's funny. That's funny. Yeah. So she remembered correctly. That's great. And she didn't tell me the part that your grandfather invented the ice cream soda. That's unbelievable.
There are a couple other claimants, although his claim is earlier than the others. So, depending on who you read, maybe one or of two or three people, but our family claims him, and it's been in invention books I discovered in our library in Michigan that he invented the ice cream soda.
Unbelievable. Well, it must run in the family because you invented a pretty good textbook as well. So, well, that's great. Why don't you tell us a little bit? You're from Seattle, right? You're born and raised?
Yes, I was born in Seattle and grew up in Seattle and went to Seattle Public Schools and also lived part of each year here on the island. So I spent maybe 35% of my life here on this island on the beach and about 65% in Seattle. And commuted to school some, actually, in Seattle Public Schools from the island here, and grew up fishing for salmon and having friends in both places.
Do you have a salmon story that's memorable?
Well, I would say one was when I was a child, maybe 10 or 12 years old, out fishing for salmon. I was taught by my dad, who taught me how to salmon fish, exactly how much tension to have on the reel in order to be able to reel the fish in, but also not break the line. And I got probably the biggest salmon I've ever had in my life on, and it wouldn't come in, and I just instinctively cinched that reel down. So I gave the salmon no chance to run with a line and was cranking it in. And I got it close enough to the boat that I could see it in the water about 10 feet down. And it was the biggest salmon I've ever had on. And it just broke all the hooks. And I lost a heartbreaking, yes.
Those are the ones that you remember.
One that got away.
Oh, I love to fish. It's one of the things I love about being up in the Northwest. I was on the Cedar River in Renton. It just opened up a little while ago and caught a bunch of fish yesterday.
Right.
So. But this isn't about fishing or about me, so because I can definitely go down that rabbit trail. So born and raised in Seattle Public Schools. Did you always know that you would go to college after school?
Yes. My father was on the board of Whitworth University in Spokane, and all his children went there. And so I just knew that's where I was going. So I never even thought about where I was going to go to college. He was an insurance agent. And as a teenager, I worked in the family business. And so my first vocational option was taking over the family business, entering and ultimately taking over the family business. So my little claim to fame was, as a 16-year-old, I became the youngest licensed insurance salesperson in the state of Washington, having passed a state exam, but I never sold a policy.
Wow.
My dad, by the way, just another little story, also had many customers here on the island, including a number of the Japanese Americans who became the first internees in 1942. It was on March 24th, 1942, that the Japanese American population of the island was given 6 days to appear at the dock with one suitcase to begin the internment. And that was because the south end of the island overlooked a narrow passageway into a major naval shipyard. And so my dad was on the dock that day weeping and saying goodbye to his friends and neighbors who were incarcerated.
Wow.
And we just this year, 2017, remembered the 75th anniversary of the beginning of that internment, which happened about 1 mile as the crow flies from where we're seated right now on that afternoon of March 30th, 1942.
Wow.
And so when I come to the island, I always go there. There's a national memorial there, and perhaps we can visit it this afternoon before I send you back to Seattle.
That'd be great. I was just going to say I've never even heard of it, so that's great. Obviously, an important story in your family history.
Exactly.
Yeah. So your father worked at Whitworth College, is that?
No, he was an insurance agent
but all
here
the
in
kids
Seattle.
went there. Got
and
it.
so, by the way, during the Second World War, he protected the property of his Japanese American friends and customers against the wishes of the insurance company that felt they were a great risk, and continued to develop this business in Seattle. So I went off to Whitworth University. What am I going to study? I don't know. Maybe to become a business person in Seattle. But while there, I decided to become a doctor. So I was a pre-med student. I majored in chemistry. I minored in biology. I worked 3 summers at what you know as Harborview Hospital, which is the county hospital here in Seattle, as an orderly, working different wards and working mostly, more than anything else, in the emergency room. And it was a fascinating experience. But at the end of my junior year, having taken so much hard science and looked at so many cells through a microscope and watched so many physicians examine x-rays on the wall and what all, I decided that I didn't want to become a doctor. And by that time, by the way, I had taken the medical college admissions test. I had half completed my applications to the University of Washington, Oregon medical schools, but I never mailed those applications in.
Yeah.
And I was also that summer getting married to somebody I met while at Whitworth. And so people were asking her parents, what's this young man going to do? And, well, he doesn't know. He thought he was going to become a doctor, but that's not going to be it. He decided not to go to medical school. But then I decided to become a professor. That would be cool.
Yeah.
I'd like to be a professor like these people here on this campus with me. But I needed something to profess. And I knew it wasn't going to be chemistry. And I looked back to the one psychology class I had had in my first year of college. It was the only class I'd had. And I thought, that was really neat. I think I'll become a psychology professor. This, by the way, is not the way to do it.
Right.
But I'm not recommending this as advice. But I took several more psych classes my senior year, and partly on the strength of that natural science background, was able to get admitted into a couple PhD programs and went to the University of Iowa.
Wow. Do you remember who that psych teacher was?
Yeah, his name was Ron Short. I remember the textbook was by Floyd Rue. It later became Rue and Zimbardo. Later became Zimbardo. Later became Zimbardo and such. Thus reminded me of my father's story of the woodsman who used the same axe in the woods for his 38-year career. It only had 9 new handles and 17 new blades.
Right. Same axe.
Same book.
Same book. Wow. And do you remember anything remarkable about the teacher himself?
Yeah, I was just a very nice, gentle person. I just enjoyed how I felt when I was in the class.
Yeah.
But the whole subject of human nature and who we are and how we experience the world, I mean, it's just, what more interesting subject is there?
Right. No. And it's and from that point on, it was a motivating factor for kind of the next few steps that you would take, I guess.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, when I got to the University of Iowa, I should tell you, here again, things didn't work out as I'd anticipated, because I went there having read some books by Gordon Allport and thinking I was interested in personality psychology. And I picked Iowa because I'd heard of the Iowa Test of Educational Development, so I knew that was kind of a famous school. And as soon as I got there, like within 2 days, I learned 2 things. One, the Iowa Test of Educational Development had nothing to do with the psych department. And the second, my advisor whom I met said in our first conversation, Dave, I know you put down personality psychology is what you're interested in, but the person we have in that area just left, so we've moved you into social psychology. So that's the story of how I became a social psychologist. And everything else that's happened since then has also been unplanned and unanticipated. And the reason I belabor the story and occasionally tell it to students, I say to them, you have no reason to be interested in my life story, but the only thing you might find interesting about it is that I predict this is going to be your life story too. Mm-hmm. That if you are now an undergraduate or if you are a high school, maybe AP student, the surest prediction I can make is that what you're going to ultimately end up doing when you're 30 and 40 years old is not what you're thinking of right now. It's something else. Life is unpredictable, and you can't know what's around the corner and what opportunities, what disappointments, but what exciting opportunities as well are going to be available to you. And that's why the best education is an education for the unpredictable future. Learning how to think and write and communicate and what values you are and to understand who you are so that when those opportunities and challenges present themselves, you're prepared to deal with them.
Yeah. So do you think, I've been hearing a lot of conversation in the last few years just about skills in psychology and in general education, the importance of general education for psych majors. Even at my institution now, when somebody's going to be a psych major at our community college, we say, hey, don't take every psych class. Let's get these other things.
Yeah.
Let's get a foundation of these other things so that you have these valuable tools, which can you have a lot of utility wherever you end up.
Absolutely. And if you want to become a psychologist, maybe a mental health worker, maybe a professor, could go in various directions, you're going to get a professional education in order to actually become a psychologist.
Yeah.
Just like if you're a biology student, you're not going to become a physician without going to medical school. So yes, I think what we call a liberal education that broadly educates somebody for the unpredictable future is for most students going to be a more valuable education than a focused vocational track on, let's say, hotel management. If you become a hotel manager for the rest of your life, then that's great.
Yep.
But chances are that's not going to be your life story.
Interesting. So as you look back over your path through education and just its the unpredictableness of it, do you take any do you make any meaning of it? Do you take any lessons away from it other than preparation? Because now you're on, you've had this really long, successful career, and it all came out of these random...
Yeah, it was unplanned.
And
so let's, if you want, continue the story. And Albert Bandura has written about how chance encounters shape lives. Things you just couldn't have predicted, just fortuitous chance encounters, and you end up in a relationship with somebody, you end up in a vocation. Call it chance, call it providence, depending on what your life perspective is and your worldview. But so I got my PhD at the University of Iowa, wanted to become a teacher and be teaching focused. And in some sense, I've been able to sustain that focus ever since. And so I wasn't aiming to become a research psychologist. And that was what my mentors really wanted me to do and be at a research university. But along the way, I got unexpectedly interested in a particular research puzzle, which had to do with the effects of group interaction on people's attitudes. It came to be called the group polarization phenomenon. And I was able to engage that right at the beginning, very soon after that this particular phenomenon had been discovered, and to stay with that for 10 or 12 years and become, in that little niche of psychology, something of an expert. And so that led me, when I went to Hope College after the University of Iowa, to apply for some research grants, and the National Science Foundation was generously supportive with several grants, and then to be invited by a professor at the University of Illinois, James Davis, to join 7 other Americans at a group research conference in Germany that was being funded by their National Science Foundation. So there were 8 West Germans, 8 other Europeans, and 8 Americans. And at that conference, I was seated by the conference hosts next to two famous American social psychologists, one of whom Irving Janis of groupthink fame, and the other a University of Massachusetts professor named Ivan Steiner. And because of the seating lottery, I tended to get to know the people that were near me at the conference, and I got to know them. And they were both very kind to me afterwards. And a few months after the conference, Ivan Steiner was asked by McGraw-Hill, which is a major college textbook publisher, to work on a social psychology text for college students. And he declined, but he gave them my name. And that was the beginning then of my engagement. And that's a whole story in itself. Point is that I could live my life over 1 million times and I wouldn't be a textbook author because I never sought that out. But by chance, James Davis happened to think to invite me. Mm-hmm. And chance, or is it by providence, when Ivan Steiner was called and asked to write this social psych book, actually co-authored, but ended up authoring it, he, out of the thin air, gave them my name.
Wow.
Now, if those things hadn't happened, we wouldn't be having this conversation today, probably.
Yeah, wow.
And so I could live my life over many times, and my career would have been different. It would have still been satisfying, I think. But
Yep. So your first book was a social psych?
Correct. My first textbook was a social psychology textbook.
Okay. Yeah, very, very interesting. So you get your PhD.
Right.
At Iowa.
Right.
And then you did you get a job right out of...
Correct. Oh,
yeah,
this is
right out of university.
You're not going to want to hear this, but I almost hesitate to tell this story. But I was born during the war, so I was in my mother's womb when the internment began in 1942, which meant I was a war baby. And there weren't many babies born during the war because so many men were off at war. After the war, men came home and there were a lot of babies born.
Okay. Yeah.
So when I got my PhD, there weren't many other people getting PhD in my cohort.
Yeah.
Because I was kind of a part of the birth dip in the history of American demography.
Yeah.
But when I was getting my PhD and coming out, suddenly colleges were being flooded with all these babies that were being born after the war. So there weren't many people with new PhDs looking for jobs, and there were a lot of colleges with growing enrollments looking for faculty. And so how did I search for my first job? I just went through all the letters from all the places looking for faculty in my department file, and I picked 3 places to apply to, and I got interviews and job offers from all 3, and I picked one. So I'm sorry. It was so simple. And since then, I've seen at Hope College, we get dozens of applications now for a single position. I'm not sure my college had more than 1 or 2 other applicants when I applied.
Wow.
So that's more the history of the American professoriate.
Right.
You want to hear that.
Yeah. So how did schools hire back then? Did they actually send physical letters to other institutions, say if you have any students who are going to be looking for work? Okay.
Correct.
Yeah.
So there's job files. So you'd send out letters to the universities that produce the people in the sub area, like social psychology. So every university that had a PhD program in social psychology would get these letters.
Do you remember the other 2 that you turned down? I guess because you had offers.
Yes, they were Lawrence University.
Where's that?
In Appleton, Wisconsin.
Okay.
And Lycoming College in Pennsylvania. Okay. And they're both great places, wonderful places.
And why'd you choose Hope?
It's interesting. Hope, I guess maybe I like the warmth of the place. The ecology of the place suited me, having grown up in the Northwest with trees and water, and there was more of that there. It was a faith-based institution that was akin to where I was. And even then, we thought we'd just stay there 3 years and eventually move back home here to the Northwest, which is where my wife is from as well as myself. But we just became rooted there and never moved back.
Right.
I was at lunch yesterday with a senior University of Washington professor and was reminiscing about when I gave an invited talk at the university, must have been in the late 1970s, and a couple of their social psychologists afterwards took me out and said, excuse me, I paused because my wife was calling me. That's what I had to shut off.
That's
the
fine.
call.
If you need to take it, you can take
no,
it.
that's fine.
Okay.
That's just why the pause. I wasn't having an emotional breakdown here.
That's right. They can't see you. I forgot. Yeah.
And anyway, I was told that there was going to be an opening here for a social psychologist, and if I wanted to come home to Seattle, this was my opportunity to at least be a candidate for that. So I went home and said to my wife, either we do this now, or we reserve our burial plots in the cemetery on 16th Street in Holland, Michigan. And she said, book the burial plots.
Wow.
So
yeah.
we're still there.
Okay. Do you need to get back to your wife?
Nope.
All right. Well, if your wife comes in while we're having the interview, we'll just include her into it.
Right.
Okay. So you get that job, and you got that job what year?
1967.
And you have been at Hope College ever
Correct.
since.
Now, I just finishing my 50th year.
Are you the longest serving faculty member?
Correct. So I'm the senior person among the 900 plus employees there.
How many students do you have?
3,000.
Okay. Yeah. And what did you start teaching when you started your career
So
there?
what have I been teaching?
Well, what did you teach when you first got hired?
Yeah, so really, my teaching focused on two things: introductory psychology and social psychology.
Mm-hmm.
And I taught multiple sections of both, usually every year. So I've taught dozens of sections of each, occasionally some other seminars on special topics, but mostly just focused on those two.
For your entire career?
Correct, as long as I was teaching. Now, the last 20 years, I've had a weird appointment. I'm not retired. I'm a full-time professor, but I've been unsalaried for the last 20 years. So I'm funded from the outside for teaching to a wider student audience and being available to travel and speak and
Right, you're right.
and whatever, and to guest lecture at my own institution.
Yep. And when's the last time you actually taught a section of...
Well, I've done a little bit of co-teaching, like of a seminar, but it was probably 20 years ago when I had my own section where I had to make up my own exams and such.
Right. I remember this. You can tell me if this is accurate. I remember this story about you that you would have your students come to your office to meet you face to face.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Okay.
It always struck me when I first heard you talk about it. I thought that's really interesting.
Again, this is just how I got to know my students. So I would typically have 35 students in a section, and if I was teaching 2 sections of social psych, then there'd be 70 students. And so to get to know them and become comfortable with them, I would do 2 things. One, I would take a picture of the class, actually several pictures of the class, and then staple those pictures to a seating chart where they had signed their name. They never had to sit there again, but it gave me a little crib sheet so that I could see who every person was. Second thing I did is the first day, invited everybody the next day to come to my office for 5 minutes. So let's say I'm doing this with 70 people. That's maybe 10 an hour, so it's maybe 7 hours. I spend my day doing this. And so it gives me a chance in 5 minutes to ask people where they're from, why they're at Hope, why they're in this course. And at the conclusion of this conversation, to let them know that this door is always open for them. They're welcome back anytime. And then the second day I walk into class, suddenly what I'm looking at are not 35 strangers in each section who have me nervous. I'm looking at 35 people who are, well, they're not yet my friends, but I've had friendly eyeball-to-eyeball conversation with every one of them about who they are. And it just makes me more comfortable as a teacher.
Well, it's got to do something for the students, too.
I hope so, but I know it does something for me.
Yep. Yeah, it's... And now you required that from them, right?
Yes. I mean, I didn't actually ding them points if they didn't come, but 85% would remember to show up. Everybody signed up, and almost everybody showed up.
Yeah, good. I don't remember why I now take pictures of students and memorize names, but it may have been that story. And I found such a benefit. I found that it's just so engaging Well, I think it just works to engage students if you know them by face and by name very, very early on. So yeah, it's been a good strategy. Wow. So can you just talk about when you took on like authoring a textbook, a social psych textbook, eventually an intro psych textbook, and then variations of these textbooks? How did that? Maybe you can just talk about the kind of the evolution of how that worked, because I don't know that I know how did these become successful, because they have become moderately successful.
Well, first, just the story of the textbook. So I was invited to do this social psychology textbook, and when that was being finished, the editor for that book went over to Worth Publishers and became in charge of their acquisitions and invited me to consider doing an introductory psychology book. And I demurred it a little bit at first, because I've so long told my wife that when the book gets done, I'll get the shelves up, or when the book gets done. And she didn't want to hear when the book gets done anymore. And I was really kind of intimidated about the idea of trying to be an introductory psych author, because I was just a little guy at a Midwestern liberal arts college. But they persuaded me to come to New York City and hear their story and hear the appeal. And I let McGraw-Hill know I was having this conversation with Worth Publishers, and so I simultaneously had the same conversation with them. And after some weeks, both asked what would it take to get you to author this book. I didn't know it was reasonable to ask, but I just said, if you could pay my salary for 2 years, just don't give it to me, just give it to Hope College so that I'm free for 2 years to author the book. Then it's what I do during the day. It's just what I do when I go to work. And I'd learn a whole lot about psychology. I'd become a better teacher, and even if the book never sold a copy, I would have made the same living, so what's there to lose? Yeah. So I finally decided I would do it, and then it was a very agonizing decision to decide which publisher to do this with. So that's the story of how I came to do these books, not because it was my idea, or neither was my idea. As to how we went about creating them, first I began with, I would say, a fairly low degree of self-confidence. Mm-hmm. And so I told myself the only way I was going to compete with or be on the same stage with all these other more famous people was to outwork them. Nobody was going to outwork me. That was thing number one. And secondly, I was going to develop myself as a writer. And so to do that, I read a number of writing manuals that coach good writing. I put my writing through a computer grammar checker that, for example, flagged all instances of passive voice. I took to reading great nonfiction writing to see, particularly nonfiction writing related to the sciences, Carl Sagan, Lewis Thomas's books of essays, but also just C.S. Lewis and other great writers to try and absorb what it was that they were doing. Then the fourth thing I did, and the most valuable, was to engage a writing coach who became the Carnegie Professor of the Year for State of Michigan. He was just a phenomenal writing teacher and an award-winning poet. And he became my writing coach and mentor. And over several years, he edited and coached me on some 5,000 manuscript pages. So it was like taking advanced expository writing and then advanced expository writing. And so he helped me to become comfortable with my own voice. The idea that I have a voice was a foreign idea to me. To have some idea how to order words for impact, how to create cadence and rhythm, and things like that. And so we did a couple of articles together, but he edited several book manuscripts before any publisher ever saw them, and it was just an extremely useful exercise. I mean, he was compensated for this, so I mean, it was satisfying to him, I think, in every possible way, as well as it certainly was satisfying to me.
And how has, if you look back at a first edition compared to a more recent edition, what differences do you see in voice, in quality, and I don't know. I think I relate everything back to in this podcast. I often relate things back to music for some reason, but I think about a band that's had a long career, and you look at their first album and then their most recent albums, and you wonder, is this the same? Is it the same band? Do they regret anything that they did early on, or how is it different?
Yeah, I think the voice is much the same across all the editions. So part of the effort was to create a personal voice, to be having a conversation with real people. That is, I see myself as not just teaching a discipline, but having a person-to-person conversation with students, many of whom are at key points in their own lives about really important things. And so I'm asking myself, not just what does psychology need taught, but what's humanly significant here? And then how can I tell that story in a way that they will find interesting and memorable?
Yeah.
And I want to have fun. And so if I have a playful urge, or if I have a pun, or if I have something silly, I don't censor myself too much at the beginning. The editors can tell me when to pull it back.
Right. Yeah.
But if I'm not having fun creating this, nobody's going to have fun reading it.
Right. Now, how has the content changed over those years?
Sure. So the content has evolved with the field.
Yeah.
So behavior genetics, neuroscience, evolutionary psychology are all much bigger topics today than when I started. And so they have a more visible presence integrated throughout these books.
Yeah. And have you had to, how do you let go of content that becomes
good question,
irrelevant,
Garth.
or
it's a great question, Garth, because everything you add has to supplant something else, or else the book's going to grow longer and longer and longer. So every word that is added has to be offset by some word that's taken out. And so part of the pain of writing new editions is letting go of one's babies from the past.
Right. Yeah. And well, I think here's a question that I've had conversations about with others is, why are we still talking about certain Freud theories or other theories?
Oh, yes.
Do they belong in our intro psych textbook?
That's a great question that I was just wrestling with this morning. So
timely.
So I was going over the copy editing of the emotion chapter for what will be the AP, the forthcoming new AP edition. So we have James Lang, Canon Bard, Schachter Singer, and so forth. These old things. I mean, they're like Freud. Freud I can justify because he's part of our kind of cultural heritage. He's part of literature and film and so forth, and we ought to have some understanding of what his ideas were.
Sure.
Quite apart from psychology. Some of these old psychology theories, why do we keep teaching them? Partly it's because we've always taught them.
Yeah.
And in the case of the AP text, it's because we've always taught them. They're therefore on the AP exam. And because they're on the AP exam, you have to continue to teach them. Hold it. This means we're trapped.
Yeah.
Now, how do we get out of this trap?
Yeah. I think Dave Myers will tell us how.
Well, so I can remember there was some disorder that used to teach somatoform disorders or something like this. And I'm thinking, well, that's a level of detail that high school students don't need to know, maybe. And so I let it go. But then it showed up on the exam, and then teachers were mad because it wasn't in the book. Well, the reason it was on the exam is because I'd always had it in the book, because the book was widely used for the AP class.
Right.
And so I was locked into this, I don't know, catch-22 or this kind of spiral situation. I couldn't break out. So I think the answer is we break out gradually and slowly. We evolve slowly. We mutate by addition. And so you're not going to do something that's radically different from what teachers are expecting their books to have, or you're not going to have any teachers teaching your book.
Right, because the system and the teaching are built around what we've done for decades.
So it's very conservative, really.
Right. And so when when an author comes along and they're going to write a new textbook and it's going to let go of all that old information, I suspect that it's going to have difficulty getting, maybe
getting traction.
Exactly right.
Right.
Yeah. What's happening just to talk textbooks? What's happening in the world of textbooks these days? Oh, your wife's here. I'm assuming this is your wife.
I'm sure it is. If somebody just walked in the house behind me.
Yeah, no, that's fine. We in this podcast we take everything very casually, so
Okay.
It's fine. We can even say hi. You won't put our dozens of viewers or podcast listeners won't mind.
Okay.
What was I talking? Oh, I was talking about textbooks. What are you seeing right now? Are you seeing anything different?
Sure. I would say there's two big things that are in process. One is the world is going digital. And so all textbooks, and I'm not here just speaking about mine, exist in a digital form now, so you can read them online, but you can get them with all sorts of interactive pedagogy that offer simulations, online quizzes that's adapted to your level of learning, video clips, concept practice exercises. There's a whole set of interactive, active learning pedagogies that are now available with today's textbooks. And you can read the text either in print or online and still have these interactive online teaching resources available to you as a teacher and to your students. So that's one thing. Second thing that's much talked about is the kind of the growth in free online resources that people are, in some sense, home brewing, and that can deal with the enormous costs of today's text by offering things free online. Publishers' response to that is partly, well, if you use the online versions of their books, you cut the cost in half right there.
Sure.
And also, they're wanting to make the case that what's invested in the development of their resources is so beyond what any one of us, certainly what I could have done solo on my own, even with a team of people,
Yep.
both in creating narrative that is engaging and accurate and closely reviewed, and in creating all these interactive pedagogies that we're talking about, that's a difficult thing to do
Right.
locally.
Right. Yeah. It seems like the spirit behind it is for students to keep costs down,
Right.
and yet so that's great for our students, but it has its other challenges.
Yeah, I think keeping costs down is important. I mean, I'm aghast at what students sometimes pay for new books, even though often they will sell those books back, and so their net cost at the end of the semester is something less. But I'm also a little gassed what they pay for a rock concert ticket or to go to an NFL football game. And I think, what's really important? And I think education is really, really important.
That's a really interesting point.
And so
I'll have to chew on that.
why value it less? And the quality of teaching matters. Our students are getting better taught in some classes than in others. Some teachers are exciting and well-informed and committed and engaged and effectively teaching, and other teachers less so. Well, the same is true of print materials as well and online resources.
Yeah.
Some are high quality and engaging and others less so, and it's up to the marketplace to decide which is which. But I think it matters. I think good teaching, whether it's good teaching face-to-face in the classroom or good teaching through prepared resources, matters. And I think there are differences, and I think those differences matter, and I think education matters.
Right. So you mentioned resources. Instructor, how many editions of your intro psych textbook have come with instructor resources? Or do you remember when that started?
All of them.
All of them.
Yeah. So
okay,
this is the 12th edition is going to appear in the fall.
Okay. And because I know you have poured a lot of time and effort into even the instructor resources and manual.
Yeah. Some, though, most of those resources are done by people who are dedicated to creating the testing resources, and that's what they focus on, or the instructors' resources. Your former colleague Sue France is gifted at this,
Yep.
and at training people on how to use effectively interactive digital resources, for example.
Yeah.
By the way, I just gave you a little example there of another part of my childhood that's little known. It only occasionally comes out, and that is that as a child, I was a stutterer, and I had speech therapy.
Wow.
And you just got a little disfluency there for a moment,
Oh,
a little glimpse
interesting.
back into an echo of my childhood.
Is that a rarity?
Yeah, it's relative rarity now. But
I make people nervous, so.
no, but hearing loss and stuttering are the two afflictions I've lived with.
Yeah. Are you still doing a lot of work with hearing loss? A lot of
Yes.
education, like talks and.
Yes, I'd say so. I have a website, hearingloop.org, that's hosted by Hope College, that is the kind of the go-to place for information on this technology that, along with many others now, I advocate. And it's coming to Seattle here as well as to the Midwest and New York City and other places. And what it does is it takes a signal from a PA system or a television or whatever, one of the new taxis in New York City, they all have it, and it broadcasts that sound directly to hearing aids with no other equipment needed. So all I have to do is press a button, and if my hearing aid has a little magnetic receptor called a telecoil, which most hearing aids do, then when I activate that telecoil, my hearing aids become in-the-ear speakers for the broadcast of sound. And so it's really, really, really cool.
Yeah.
And
it's hearing low because if you are in the literal loop of the wire,
sure.
then you are experiencing this.
So this house we're sitting in is looped, and so the TV sound will feed the loop. I can have the TV sound literally off, so you don't hear a thing unless you turn up the volume.
So I wouldn't hear it, but you would be hearing it.
Correct, because it would broadcast to my hearing aids wirelessly.
Yeah.
So
I remember we had you at Highline College, and we were like, should we ask Dave to do the happiness talk, or should we ask him to do this hearing loop thing? And we decided the hearing loop talk would be really interesting.
Yeah.
And
thank you for doing that. By the way, everybody wants the happiness talk. The hearing talk is only about hearing loops at the end. It's more broadly about hearing, but that's been sort of my avocational passion, and I've just finished 4 years on the Advisory Council of the National Institute on Deafness and Other Communications Disorders, representing Americans with hearing loss.
Wow.
So that's, I'd love to talk about that.
Yeah. Well, we really enjoyed it. I personally enjoyed it a lot, and in psychology, I feel like we are always looking for some way to make this the content recognizable for students or applicable to their lives, and everybody's got somebody who in their lives who's maybe older who has some hearing loss.
Sure.
I have somebody in my family who is unwilling to admit it, which happens as you probably know, and so it's really important. And then I remember from your talk that Europe's doing a really, like, comparatively, Europe's quite a far way ahead of maybe what's going on in the United States. I remember that you talked about a trip to England or something like that, and you had.
Oh yeah, well, I first discovered this overseas because in the UK and Scandinavia, this technology is everywhere, and it was essentially unknown here in the United States. And so, having this amazing experience where I sat in this ancient abbey, couldn't hear a thing as the sound reverberated off the stone walls, and then finding that when I pressed a button, suddenly the person was speaking from the center of my head in this clear voice. I was like on the edge of tears. And I thought, and since then, it's like everywhere in the United Kingdom, virtually every church or cathedral auditorium that has a PA system. Guys, why can we not have this in the United States? And that's what led me to start this initiative in West Michigan, where we now have many hundreds of installations. and to create this website and to write almost 20,000 emails over the last 15 years. But lots of other people are doing the same. So there's pods of consumers with hearing loss all over the United States, here in Washington State, Arizona, New Mexico, Wisconsin, Florida, New York City, and so forth.
Right. So it was that one experience in the Abbey that...
Correct.
Yeah.
A light bulb went off.
Sent you down this path.
Right.
Yeah, chance encounters, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's back to where we started.
No, that's exactly right. Yeah, so it's funny, after that talk, I have to say, it was like not even on my radar, and ever since then, when I go into a public space, when I host something, I'm thinking about hearing loss.
Sure.
And even in restaurants, like loud restaurants,
Yes.
Taking like people like my parents or whatever out, I think about these kinds of things now, and I never did before. So there you go. Psychology has something to do with our lives, apparently.
Sure.
Hey, I'm about to head out to the AP reading in the next few days. This podcast probably will come out afterwards, but yeah, I know that they've been using your textbook for quite a long time now. We already mentioned that. Maybe you can tell us about you work at a university or Hope College,
Right.
How did you start to get involved with high school teachers, and what's your relationship with ETS or the AP community, or how did that happen?
I would say, well, first of all, the AP course didn't exist when I first started authoring an introductory psych text. So the AP exam was given for the first time to a little over 3,900 students in 1992, and it was given this past May to over 300,000 students. So it's just mushroomed enormously. It's just exploded. It's grown like 11% a year after year after year over the last quarter century. And so I guess maybe I had the good fortune that some of the people who led the early workshops for AP teachers were people I had good relationships with and who made my book visible. I didn't have anything to do with it because I'm not involved particularly in the sales or marketing of anything I write. And then, I don't know, by word of mouth, it spread. And I've been privileged to speak at one of the AP exam grading sessions. It's just wonderful. I mean, I just love AP teachers, and I hear from lots of them, and I hear from their students in large numbers, and it's just been extremely gratifying. And this summer, in about a month, I'll be speaking to the APA National Summit on the teaching of high school psychology.
I'll see you there.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
in
yeah.
Salt Lake, I guess near Salt Lake City.
Ogden, right? Weber State.
Oh, terrific.
Yeah, great. So you're gonna give an address to us there.
Right.
That's cool. Great. Yeah. So I'm heading out to do that, and as I've gotten to know high school teachers, you ask, hey, what book do you guys use for that? And they say, well, we use Myers AP psychology book, and so that's interesting. And can you believe it? I was such a poor student when I got into university that I took a psychology class, and I can't remember. Well, why would I remember which textbook I had? But did you ever have a textbook, an early edition around 97, where and it may not have been yours, where there was a profile of a kind of a face, but it was a drawn face? Was that ever a textbook cover of yours? Okay, well then that's what I remember from it. So I actually used your textbook when I was taking my Psych 100 class at the University of Saskatchewan in Canada.
Oh, really? You're Canadian?
Uh-huh. Yeah, I'm from Saskatoon.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, it's just so interesting. I can speak for so many teachers, whether high school or for myself, use your book for a number of years, that we just really appreciate the work that you've put in.
Thank you.
And the voice. There is something about you're not the only textbook that has a really nice voice for students to read, but it is sure accessible, and so it's been.
Thank you. You're very kind, Garth.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
Well, it's been very helpful, and I appreciate that you've always been willing to take time as well to talk and to fly out and give talks, and so I appreciate that. What is the last question I just have for you is and I don't mean to make this awkward for you, but what about legacy? Like, what do you think about when you think about legacy? in the in what you've contributed to the field of psychology. Anything come up for you with those words?
Well, one hopes through teaching, all of us hope, I hope, you hope, Garth, to assist people who are developing to become more understanding, more compassionate, more capable of critical thinking about the world, in some sense, being wiser people than they might otherwise be. And if by our writing and by our direct classroom teaching, we can make a contribution in that direction, and that can carry on over time, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
Our world needs understanding, compassion, justice, peace, sustainability in the future. And so education has an important contribution to make to that. And so long after I'm gone, I'm hoping, and you're hoping, that people whom you've had just a little influence on may carry that forward. And in my case, I'm privileged because I'm able to talk to a lot of people in a lot of countries, actually, in varied languages, to try to have that sort of influence. And so for me, it's a calling, and there's nothing more meaningful I could be doing, and that's why I'm still doing it.
Yeah, that's good. What's next for you? Do you have any major projects? Are you working on revisions? Are you...
Correct. So yes, still new editions coming along, and so I have deadlines to meet.
Wow.
For social psychology, 13th edition is next up, starting this summer.
And you're not slowing down, are you?
Not yet.
Okay.
I had lunch yesterday with the University of Washington professor who's 76 and was telling me that two of his esteemed colleagues retired when they were 83, and he's hoping to go that long before he retires. I'm not sure that what's my future? I can't know, and you can't know what your future is either, but I'm blessed to still have the energy and the passion.
Yeah, good. Well, on behalf of psychology teachers everywhere, thank you for what you've done for psychology, and from Eric and I, thanks for being a guest on this podcast.
Thank you so much, Garth, for welcoming me into this conversation.
Yeah.
It's been a pure pleasure.
Good. Well, take care. Bye, everybody.